On March 17th, 2022, a mechanical engineer student ran onto the Everton Newcastle football field in the middle of a match and tied his neck to a goalpost, almost suffocating himself in the process. The game came to a halt for a whole 7 minutes before the officials could cut the ties and pull the protester off of the field. At a press conference following the unusual event, the protester stated that the fans were screaming at me, hoping it worked, hoping that my air was cut off long enough to really feel it. This is the first time the Just Stop Oil protesters broke into the mainstream eye, which led to a flurry of new public protests, each eliciting a greater public response. Some were throwing orange paint on the buildings, which got media headlines. Others, a group of protesters, interrupted the World Snook Championships by throwing an orange powder into the air. Note at this point catching onto as one of the two protesters were restrained before being able to disrupt the event. However, the world did not catch the two protesters who threw soup onto the $76 million Van Gogh Sunflowers painting in London's National Gallery. While only a few were mentioned, there were hundreds of other forms of protest that took place after the group initially formed. So who is Just Stop Oil? What do they want? And is the public supportive of their cause? This is Jeff Butler with your daily dose of workplace commentary. Who is Just Stop Oil? The key in this story is Roger Hallam, a British environmental activist and the founder of the political party Political Pink. Between the years of 2017 and 19, he was studying for a PhD at the King's College London, researching how to achieve social change through civil disobedience and radical movements. However, he did not finish his PhD. He went on to enter the 2019 European Parliament election in the London contingency. He stood unsuccessful and as an independent, winning only 124 votes over the 2 million votes cast. During this period, Hallam and the 4 other activists were arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to plan action to pilot drones in the exclusion zone around Heathrow Airport in order to disrupt flights. However, after the event of being arrested, he made headlines again, where in an interview with Die Zeit, stated that genocides are a regular event in history and called the Holocaust just another fuckery in the human history. In a 20-page essay calling on young people to take a legal direct action to save their generation from annihilation, Hallam wrote that the climate crisis could lead to mass and feature a story in which Raiders' female family members are gang and the reader is forced to watch. So how is Roger Hallam related to Just Stop Oil? Well, it turns out he is one of the main founders of the movement. Also, before founding Just Stop Oil in 2022, he also participated in starting the Extinction Rebellion in 2019 and Insulate Britain in 2021. All of these movements are focused on climate change activism. Today, each of these groups now have dozens of chapters worldwide and enlist thousands of members. Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain have both contributed protests such as the blocking of the port of Dover, where 38 arrests were made, and also the River of Thames in 2018. And sometimes smaller protests will reach media headlines such as this one. So outside of climate change, what is Just Stop Oil really fighting for? Well, Just Stop Oil's main argument is increased greenhouse emissions. The weather will change, creating famine and the collapse to modern-day society. Their main position comes from a United Nations report released in 2015 during the Paris climate talks. This report stated that there will be roughly a 2.7 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. Governments that sign on to the Paris Agreement are expected to reach the following goals. 1. Substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit the global temperature increase in this century to 2 degrees Celsius. Second goal is to review countries' commitments every 5 years. The third agreement is to provide financing to developing countries to mitigate climate change, strengthen resilience, and enhance abilities to adapt to climate impact. On another note, it is unusual to see Mark Zuckerberg at a UN meeting when he was spotted flying his private jet 28 times in 2 months in 2022. It doesn't seem like he really got on board with the reduced CO2 message. Just Stop Oil, based off of the report from the UN and other sources, summarized projections on what they thought the future would look like. On their website, they state, on our current path, 10 million deaths globally by 2030, about a third of the cropland is unusable by 2040s, and 3.5 billion people will be forced to migrate in 2070. So while sounding apocalyptic, there are various media outlets that support this vision. The World Health Organization, Nation.com, Earth.org, and even MIT Given their support for Just Stop Oil's position, why is Just Stop Oil creating protests versus debating other scientists on the consequences of climate change, as it appears there are already support for their current position? The reasoning is built into the movement, which can be seen in Roger's 20-page essay that he wrote in jail, which advocates the following.
Then what these people will say to you is you're upsetting people and, quote, as happened at King's College, you're shutting down the conversation. But the reality is, and this is one of the most important things I want to communicate, is the conversation was never getting you anywhere in the first place.
Essentially, creating protests in order to create dialogue, since the initial conversation, in his words, were not enough. So is Just Stop Oil garnering the support that they are looking for? Insulate Britain initially was supported by the Green Party, but had members speak out and say that Insulate Britain were not legitimate protesters and were irresponsible crusties, mainly due to the disrupting the lives of the people who they wanted support from. For instance, a pregnant woman getting into a car accident, public gardens being disrupted,
the flower gardens that you love.
Even the British government got involved. In May and June 2023, Parliament passed a new anti-protest legislation under the Public Order Act. The laws granted new powers to prosecute someone who interferes with the operation or use of key national infrastructure in England and Wales, including roads, railways, and air transport. Though The Guardian wasn't too happy about this policy, stating that it would remove even more rights from political protesters. Now, sitting in traffic is no longer legal, but protesters can slowly march. The royal family also had something to say about the protests, where Prince Charles, the heir to the British throne, stated that the protesters should be directed in a way that is more constructive rather than destructive. The general public started to push back, and pranksters got caught wind of Just Stop Oil and decided to give them a taste of their own medicine by setting fire alarms at a Just Stop Oil banquet in 2023. Hence, the general public doesn't seem to be getting on board with the message. But hold on. Just Stop Oil was able to rent an entire banquet hall with catering, which is expensive. So someone is funding these operations. Is Roger funding these operations? Well, looking at his Patreon, even with the public becoming aware of the protest, Roger Hallam does not have a lot of support of only $1,000 per month on Patreon, so it's probably not him. So if not Roger, who is funding these operations? According to Just Stop Oil's website, most of their funding comes from Climate Emergency Fund, a U.S. network set up in 2019 to fund climate activism. The Climate Emergency Fund is itself part funded by Elaine Getty, a U.S. philanthropist whose grandfather was the petroleum tycoon J. Paul Getty. This fund has received donations from celebrities like Jeremy Strong, Chelsea Handler, and Thomas Middleditch, which are then passed onto the activism groups such as Just Stop Oil. Looking at the tax records of the Climate Emergency Fund network, they received over $2 million in donations in 2019. However, according to The Observer, in 2022, the Climate Emergency Fund doled out over $5 million worth of grants last year. Hence, this fund has grown tremendously. With all the money being pumped into the protest, does Britain as a whole support these protests? Well, the GB News People's Poll found that just 13% of the British adults expressed any support for the disruptions that Just Oil has caused, and another poll stated that only 16% supports the protests. The frustrated public can be seen going on to social media posting things like this. You fund violence, to that the Van Gogh disruption was disturbing, and that the protesters should pay for their crimes. It appears that the funding of the protests have increased, but it consequently is creating more public animosity, with more policies being passed to create challenges for future generations of protesting. What they're doing is working to get attention, there's no doubt about that. Disrupting the people's lives who you want to enlist for your cause might be the quickest way to lose the core message, which they are successfully doing. So do you think that Just Stop Oil will start garnering public support? Or will the public continue to resent their current efforts? Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. Thank you for listening.